about a fella who was at the top of his game, if you will. Everything was going well in his life. He just was taking, it all in. He was chosen of God. He's one of the great characters of the Old Testament. And of course, his name is Elijah. And so we're going to talk about his trials and some things that he overcame when, you'd think here's a man that just doesn't have problems like we do, when that's about as far as the truth, from the truth as can be. We run across him in the New Testament in the book of James. James is in a discussion about prayer. And he's talking about that we need to be praying for each other, that prayer is a powerful, powerful tool. And in verse 16, in the midst of this discussion on prayer, he says, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. A lot to be said in these verses. You could preach an entire sermon just on what's said here. We are not only to pray for each other, but there's a part of us that needs to acknowledge God's will and follow his will so that we'll be righteous. Notice that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. So if we're living a wicked life, we don't have to worry about God answering our prayers. He's just simply not going to. You see, we have to live in accordance with God's will. And then as a righteous man, our prayers will have great avail. But that's not the discussion that I really want to have so much as I want to talk about this fellow right here. Now, the King James says in verse 17, Elias was a man. Now, you can put the word Elijah in there. It's talking about the same person. It's just Elijah is the Hebrew word, and Elias is how the Greeks would say Elijah's name. So Elias was a man subject to like passions as we are. That means he's a man. Yeah, sometimes we think of him, I think like the Apostle Paul, that he had a cape hanging in the closet, and then when he'd take his robe off, he had a big S on his chest because he just seemed to be, superhuman. But he wasn't. He was a man that had to eat. He had to drink. As we'll see in 1 Kings chapter 17, he had things that he had to keep him going. Just like a man, he had a body. He had emotions. He had highs. He had lows. And so he had suffered like passions as we do. And he prayed earnestly. The idea of prayed earnestly there is a double word in the New Testament, which means basically the same thing. He prayed prayer, or he had prayer praying. It's two words. Proseko is the idea to kiss towards, to pray towards, to worship. And it's mentioned twice for emphasis, so we have that prayed earnestly. In other words, the American Standard, New American Standard, several of the newer translations will use the idea of prayed fervently. He was fervent in his prayer, that it might not rain, and it rained not on the earth for a space of 3 years and 6 months. Verse 18 says he prayed again, at the end of that time, of course, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. So with that in mind, let's talk about this fellow named Elijah. Elijah, he is from a place called Tish. It's in Gilead. In chapter 17, at verse 1 says, Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, and he said unto Ahab. Well, we see a lot going on here to begin with. The greatest miracle worker in the Old Testament, save maybe Moses, you'd have to put them cross by cross. Moses, Elijah, and Elisha, all three together there, are just some folks that, are powerful. We call him a non-writing prophet because we don't have a book or anything that has his name on it. We think of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and so forth. And so we think that, these are, prophets, but we don't really give Elijah and Elisha the credit maybe sometimes in calling them prophets. Well, they were just that. They were prophets, but we just don't have anything written by them. So he is probably the greatest, one of the greatest miracle workers in the Old Testament. Also, he's a man's man. What do I mean by that? Just a tough fella. He could stay out in the woods. He had to camel hair girdle. I mean, all the things that we see in the New Testament of John the Baptist are kind of antiquated, or the antitype is in the Old Testament with Elijah. Very recognizable. He was a rough fella. Jesus would talk about John the Baptist. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A man in soft raiment? He says, no, of course not. And so Elijah was a man just like that. As a matter of fact, he is going to be combating. He's going to be prophesying what we call the northern kingdom. There has been a separation of God's people, the nation of Israel. You have 10 tribes to the north. They are called Israel. Sometimes they're referred to as Ephraim, which was the largest tribe in the north. Then you had the southern kingdom, referred to as Judah, and it would be made up predominantly of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And so you have to split the kingdom. Elijah is a prophet of God that's actually going to go and work in the northern kingdom, which immediately upon being established, Jeroboam, the king, puts a calf in Dan and Bethel, the farthest you can go north and the closest you can get in the south, and has Israel immediately apostatized by worshiping these pagan calves. He also starts his own priesthood, if you will, and just appoints anybody that he wants as a priest. And so Elijah is going to go into that northern kingdom to preach. His very name is a confession, the fact that God is Jehovah, or God is the Lord. The name Elijah is a compound word, Eli being the name of God. Anytime you see the El, like Bethel or Michael, anytime you got that El combination, that's referring to a powerful one, God. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, that's the plural form of El. It is Elohim. And so that means powerful ones, God, powerful one. And so El, the powerful one, is Jah, is Jehovah, is God. So Elijah's name means God is Jehovah. His very name is going against the very thing that the northern kingdom is practicing in, that they are worshiping idols. I thought so much of this man when I was taking this course for the first time 27, 28, almost 30 years ago. I was studying this book, and so happened that we had a son at that time. And I thought so much of Elijah that, of course, I liked Elisha too. I think me and Stedney argued a little bit about that. But we named our son after this man. His very name is a confession, the fact that God is God. You got to love that. Elijah, strong character, strong man. And I want you to remember that he's a fellow that went around in hard clothing, if you will, camel hair skirt, just nothing feminine about this fellow at all. Nothing soft about Elijah, nothing soft about the way he preached, nothing soft about the way he handled people. He was definitely a leader and a man's man. He appears in the northern kingdom in Israel when the most wicked king to date rules there. Of course, we know his name as King Ahab. No, not the fellow that fought the big white whale, but he is the king that the white whale fighter is named after. Ahab, he's a wicked, wicked man. In fact, his name is synonymous with wickedness in that the very woman that he married is named Jezebel. And so we think of Jezebel as absolutely the most wicked woman. I mean, how many young girls today are named Jezebel? Well, very, very few. Hopefully none, because her name is synonymous with that which you don't want to do. Her very name, Jezebel, is named after a false god. Her father was a high priest, later on to become king after a priest. He was a priest of the god Baal. And so she brings in, not only does Jeroboam start pagan worship, but the one thing, friends, when you leave the truth, you can just about go anywhere you want to go. And that's what happens with the northern kingdom. Jeroboam immediately just, hey, anybody wants to be a priest, you could buy the position. You just wanted to be able to wear a robe and run around the temple and act cool, you could do that. You give Jeroboam enough money, he would make you a priest. He didn't care. He just didn't want people going to Jerusalem where the true worship of God was going on. So that's why he set up those two places of worship. And any kind of priest you could. Well, his dynasty only lasts so long And then he is replaced by some other men, of course. Kings, that's what happens. They go the way of all the earth. So you have many different dynasties in the northern kingdom, where in the southern kingdom it's all the Davidic dynasty, or sons or kinfolk of the King David. Well, Ahab, by that time, anything goes. Once you leave the truth, what keeps you from doing anything you want to do? And the bottom line is nothing. You're no longer looking at the scriptures. You're no longer looking at the God of heaven to set the precedent, so you can do anything that you want to do. And that's exactly what we find happening in the northern kingdom. They go so far as to bring in Baal worship. Jezebel, her daddy was a high priest to the Baal. She thinks Baal's great. As a matter of fact, later on we're going to see that Elijah is going to have a contest against these prophets of Baal, in which there's between 450 and 850 of these false prophets there. And so you can see she's brought in all these guys, and so Baal worship is a big thing in the northern kingdom by this time. And so it seems like God saves his most powerful prophet to when his people need him the most. And that's what happens with Elijah. Here we have a map. Those of you who are on TV, you can see the way the kingdom was divided. You had the southern kingdom, that would be the kingdom of Judah, and then the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And above it will be Tyre and Sidon. That'll come in, those two Mediterranean port cities that are so powerful, and they're still there today. In some respects, names have changed, but they're very wealthy. And so we will see those cities as Elijah is forced to leave and go up into this area that's not even in Israel anymore. So as we do that, let's go ahead and begin with 1 Kings 17, Elijah's prayer. Notice in 1 Kings chapter 17, we've already talked about Elijah, where he came from. He's not mentioned mother or father. One of the things that is referred to about the priest Melchizedek in Hebrews, he doesn't have mother or father. Of course, he did have a mother or father, but it's just not part of the story. It's not significant enough to mention. Same thing with Elijah here. He comes on the scene. We know he's from an area called Gilead, and he goes right to Ahab. This is how his ministry starts. This is how his preaching starts. He goes right to the most wicked king that's ever been to this point, and he says, "As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word." Well, that probably didn't have a whole lot of effect on Ahab. He's probably like, yeah, right, whatever, okay. You go ahead there, you funny dressed little man. I'm the king of Israel. Well, about a year into that, I think he really got Ahab's attention. And so Ahab would start searching for Elijah everywhere. Notice in verse 2, it says, "And the word of the Lord came unto him," telling him he's got to leave. He's got to take a pilgrimage, if you will. And so he tells him to go to this place, this brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And he's supposed to stay there. And notice that he is miraculously fed by ravens while he is there. They bring him food of the mornings and food of the evenings, and he stays at the brook. And the ravens, verse 6, bring him flesh in the morning and bread and flesh in the evening. And of course he drank of the brook. But you know what? When you're in a drought, even brooks, even rivers, if it's bad enough, will dry up. And so that's the case. And so now God tells him that he's going to have to go. He's going to have to get up and go towards Zidon, or what we would call Sidon today, or later on in the Bible, and dwell there. And so he goes and he finds a widow woman. And it's interesting that she's not in Israel. She's in the northern part over here by the Mediterranean. But when God punishes people, when God is taking his wrath, and right now his wrath is aimed directly at Israel, that even the countries round about, the people round about them are going to suffer as well. He just doesn't make clouds rain at one spot and they get to the state line, if you will, and then stop raining until they get across to the next state or the next country. No, all in that area is under a severe drought. And this widow woman, she says, Elijah comes up to her and says, would you make me something to eat? And she says, look, I'm out here, I'm trying to pick up a few sticks. I've got a little bit of meal and oil left, and I'm going to pick up these sticks, go in and make a fire, and then I'm going to make the last that I have so that me and him can eat that and die. I mean, that's how desperate her situation was. Elijah says, I tell you what, you make that for me, and I'm going to take care of you. And basically, that's exactly what happens. Of course, you know the story. Her oil never runs out. Her meal doesn't run out the whole time Elijah's there. God takes care of Elijah. God takes care of her. But notice something interesting. Elijah's petition of repetition. What do I mean by that? While he's with this widow woman, she only has the son. Of course, her husband's dead. That's why she's called a widow woman. But her son becomes sick. And so it says in verse 17, the mistress of the house, the young man fell sick, and his sickness was sore, that there was no health left in him. And she said unto Elijah, What have I done to thee? Why have you brought this on me, O thou man of God? Art thou coming to me to call my sin to remembrance and slay my son? And notice he says, for her to give him his son. And it says that he took him out of her bosom, and carried him into a loft. Now, what I wanted you to notice, that he cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, thou hast brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn by slaying her son. Of course, we realize that God didn't slay his son. God didn't look down and strike him dead with lightning. What happened? This young man grew ill, and now he's dying. And Elijah's saying, this has happened. Now he says, and he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. So this child is dead, but Elijah petitions God that he'll be made alive. And he doesn't do it once. And he doesn't do it twice. But it says 3 times he stretches himself out on this child and prays to the God of heaven. Friends, I think there's a lesson in that for us. How many times do we have a prayer and we pray it and we kind of sit back and wait and nothing happens and we just kind of throw in the towel, if you will? There's a great story in the book of Luke about a widow woman who wants this judge to hear her case. She's got a beef with somebody. Obviously, somebody owes her some money or some land, or somehow she's been mistreated. And she wants this judge. Now, we're told a little bit about this judge, that he doesn't care about what men think about him. He doesn't care about what God thinks about him. He's just as independent as he can be. And this widow woman, keeps going to him and beseeching him and hollering after him, Judge, hear my case. Judge, hear my case. And he says, you know what? This woman is literally beating me black and blue. If I don't listen to her case, she's going to keep bothering me. And so he says, I'm going to listen to what she has to say. And Jesus uses that as an example of how we ought to pray. That we don't just ask God once. That we just don't ask God twice. That we continue to ask God. And the bottom line is there, this judge got tired of listening to it and said, okay, whatever, I'll do it. Jesus is using that as an example of us for God. Listen, pray. And don't just pray once, don't just pray twice, but keep praying the prayer. You keep praying and petitioning God, just like Elijah, this man of God, this prophet who's been miraculously fed by these birds, who's got taken care of, who has prayed that it not rain, and it has rained. I mean, here's a man that is God's spokesman, if you will. And yet, he prays more than once. We ought to take that as a lesson to ourselves. Notice in 1 Kings chapter 18, I think it's interesting in verse 24, the last verse of that chapter 17, the woman says, I believe you from God now after he raises her son from the dead. You'd think she'd have got that idea once she had the unlimited supply of oil and meal. But anyway, 1 Kings chapter 18, we're going to see that Elijah comes back. It came to pass after many days, the word of the Lord came unto Elijah a 3rd time. And after the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. And so Elijah went to show himself unto Ahab. Now, he's been gone a long time, and things are looking pretty bad. And there's a fella here by the name of Obadiah who actually works for Ahab. It's a bad thing, though. It's too bad for Obadiah. He's a good man. But, brethren, I think there's a lesson here. Obadiah is a good man. As a matter of fact, he's such a good man that when Jezebel is killing the prophets of God, and she has had them slain. We think about religious persecution. Here's a queen who is having her people go out and kill, having government officials go out and kill preachers of God. Obadiah is such a good fella, and he disagrees with that totally, that he takes 2 groups of them, 50 in each group, and hides them in caves and is paying for their sustenance. You see, there's an underground, if you will, in Israel who still believe in God, who want to do what's right, but the government is against God. the government, Ahab, is bringing in false gods. And so they're under, in the back room, if you will, trying to take care of these preachers and make sure they have the things that they need. That's Obadiah. What's unfortunate is that Obadiah just doesn't leave. He's right there with Ahab. In fact, he's such a good man, he's helping Ahab prosper. And that's not a good thing. Well, anyway, Ahab and, Obadiah are out. They split up their herds. The king's cattle are, like everybody else's, they're dying. And he says, we got to find some grass for these. We've been in this for 3 years. You go that way, I'll go this way. And so Obadiah goes one way, Ahab goes another way, and lo and behold, Elijah comes to Obadiah and says, you go tell your master I'm here. And Obadiah's like, oh, I can't do that. Elijah, as sure as I do that, there's nowhere on the face of the earth that Ahab hasn't sent people looking for you. And if I go and tell him that you're here and then he comes and you're not, he'll kill me. And then he tells him, look, I work with you. I'm for you. I think it's a great thing what you're doing, but, I've kept these preachers safe in these caves. Kind of gives him some backstory. And Elijah says, listen, you go tell your master I'm here and I'm going to be here when he comes back. I think it's interesting when Ahab finally lays eyes on Elijah. Notice what he says in verse 17 of 1 Kings 18. And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto Elijah, art thou he that troubleth Israel? You talking about a guy that's got it all mixed up. There's a fellow that's troubling Israel, all right, but it's not Elijah. It's the man who just spoke these words. And notice Elijah calls him on it. Here's the king who could say, offer this head, and his head would be removed. Unless God stepped in, of course. But he tells Ahab face to face, if you were, points the finger right at him and says, I have not troubled Israel, but you, thou, and thy father's house, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. You're what's brought this on. I prayed the prayer, but the answer to the prayer is from God Almighty, whom you have forsaken. You're the problem here, Ahab. And he, like so many people, don't realize he's on the wrong team. Doesn't realize that he's gave up the God of heaven to worship Baal. Because see, the way his daddy raised him, the way he was, he didn't think there was a bit of difference. But you think he'd have got that point after 3 years of no rain and talking to Elijah, but he doesn't respect that. But Elijah says, you know what? What I want you to do, verse 19, gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the grove 400, which eat at Jezebel's table. You go get those government-sanctioned preachers of yours, priests, false prophets, and you have them meet me out at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel it's pretty easy to find on the map. If you look at Israel and you see the Mediterranean there, it's a little knoll that kind of sticks up, like a little hook in it, if you will. If you come out from the Dead Sea and kind of go straight across, you'll see it right there. That's Mount Carmel, and that's where Elijah wants these false prophets and him to meet. And so he gets there, and he wants to prove that the God of heaven is indeed the God of heaven. So what does he do? He makes a deal with these prophets of Baal, if you will. He says, what we're going to do here is going to set up 2 altars. You're going to have a bull, I'm going to have a bull. You're going to cut up your bull and offer it sacrifice to Baal. I'm going to offer a sacrifice to God, and we'll see which God responds and consumes that sacrifice. They'll have to provide their own fire. You're not going to do that. So the prophets of Baal say, hey, man, we're all about that. We outnumber you 850 to 1. We'll take those odds. And so they slay their animal, and they start doing every kind of thing imaginable. They're dancing around this sacrifice. They at one point start cutting themselves because, well, Elijah now, he's a man's man. He makes fun of them. Yeah. Here's a prophet of God that says, that looks pretty silly what y'all are doing. What you're doing has nothing to do with the worship of the true God, the only God. And so he starts poking fun at them, if you will. He mocked them and cried aloud, says, for he is a God, either he's talking, or he is pursuing, or he is on a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awakened. And so they cried aloud even more. And it says they cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them. They're doing anything they can, including beating up, destroying their own bodies, to try to get this God that doesn't exist to do something. And of course, he's not going to do a thing. And so he asked the people, he asked them and says, how long halt ye between two opinions? If God be God, then serve him. If Baal be God, then serve him. And the thing that strikes me about this is that the Bible says the people answered him not a word. They're those folks that you run into from time to time who won't take a stand for anything. They just want to go with what's winning. They want to go with what everybody else is doing. They're the kind of people who pick up the grass and throw it in the air to see which way the wind is blowing. And that's the way that they're going to go. They take a stand for nothing and they fall for everything. And that's Israel right now. And so Elijah says, you know what, we're going to make this even harder. He digs a trench around the sacrifice. He has them dump water, 12 different things of water over this sacrifice to make it just impossible to start a fire. And then he calls on the God of heaven, if thou be God, then consume this sacrifice. And of course, lightning, fire, it says, came down from heaven and not only destroyed the sacrifice, but got all the water and everything around it. The water is in the trough, all of it gone. And so the people see that, and they're pretty convinced. And they immediately take out, according to the law of God, those false prophets, and they slay them. That's right. Verse 40, Elijah said unto them, take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they took them and Elijah and brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. And Elijah said unto Ahab, get thee up, go eat and drink, for there's fixed to be, you hear the sound of abundance of rain. And so Elijah goes up to a little area where they can see the sea, has his servant go look. He prays, I think it's 7 times, 7th time, verse 44. 7 times he tells that guy to go look for a cloud, and then all of a sudden one appears. And then Elijah sends his, the one that's been looking for the water, sees the cloud. He tells him to go tell Ahab he better saddle up and get home because it's fixing to be a downpour. And then we see a real interesting thing in verse 46 that Elijah girds up his loins and takes off running and actually beats Ahab back to the entrance of Jezreel. Now, here is the meat of what we want to talk about in 1 Kings chapter 19. This doesn't go the way Elijah thought it would. I would imagine when he thought about this contest and the great victory that was going to take place, that he says, you know, this is it. We have wiped out idolatry in the northern kingdom. These people are going to they're going to get on their knees. They're going to pray to the God of heaven. There's going to be a revival like you've never seen. Well, that ain't how it goes. As a matter of fact, it's the total opposite, if you will. Ahab told Jezebel, he gets home, he does like a lot of us men do. He tells his wife about his day, tells her what Elijah had done. And then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. What's she saying? I'm putting a hit out on you, if you will. I'm going to send my soldiers after you. You are going to be killed by this time tomorrow. She puts a warrant out on him. And Elijah's reaction is I guess, about as well or about what we'd all react. This man who'd been so strong, who basically pointed his finger in the king's face and said, you're the problem with Israel, not me. This man now takes off. He runs for his life. And when he saw that, it says he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah. Now he's fled to the southern kingdom. But he doesn't stop there. He'd be safe there, but he doesn't stop there. He goes a day's journey into the wilderness, having left his servant back in where he first came into Judah. Terrible thing. Brethren, if we're not careful, especially in a time like we're in right now, we can become depressed. Some depression, I think, sometimes maybe even runs in families stronger than others. But we see that very thing happen to probably one of the most miraculous working, one of the most powerful. When you think of John the Baptist, he came in the spirit of Elijah. Yeah, I mean, Elijah's a strong man. But from this lesson, from what happens to Elijah, we ought to be able to see if, well, that could happen to Elijah, it could happen to me. So let's look at some of the things. He goes and he retreated into inactivity. Instead of keeping the fight, Instead of doing what he's supposed to be doing, man, he anoints kings. He goes and preaches to thousands of people. He's a spokesman, a mouthpiece for God. And yet he retreats to inactivity. Earlier he'd faced Ahab face to face. Now he runs from his wife. Elijah withdraws from people. You know, right now, that's happening to all of us in a sense, isn't it? We're all being forced to withdraw, or actually stay in. It's not something we're used to dealing with. And with that can come emotional things. I don't know about y'all, but I miss talking to people. I've always talked to myself, but now I'm answering myself. Things are bad. Seriously, when we don't have the social activity that we're used to, you know, one of the things I keep seeing on social media is the high school students, children, you know, who are so excited to see their teachers. And that resonates, you know, I mean, that's just something you don't think about a whole lot. And here we are. We're thinking about that very thing. Well, Elijah did this on purpose, but here we have a situation where that's happening to us. We've got to be careful. He spends a night in a cave. He's entertaining the idea of he wants his life to end. Notice verse 4 says in 1 Kings 19, but he himself went a day's journey in the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree and requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Now, there's just a little bit of pride in that. And what do I mean by that? See, he thinks that he should have achieved something greater than his fathers. He thinks that his situation, it didn't work. He thinks, man, I did exactly, you know, what it just didn't, he doesn't know what to think. And sometimes that's what happens with us. We're doing what the Lord says, we're doing what we're supposed to do, and lo and behold, we become sick. Or lo and behold, something rises, I lose my job, or lo and behold, something, and you're like, this didn't work out like I thought it should. What have I done wrong? And sometimes, friends, the answer is you've done nothing wrong. But life is like that. Situations come. Elijah had done exactly what God had expected him to do. And yet what had happened? It didn't work out like he thought it ought. And see, therein lies the problem. You see, it's not in us that lies the power. Don't you know when the Christians in the first century and second and third century were in the Colosseum and they were fixing to take on wild animals with their bare hands, or given some weapon that they'd never used before for entertainment for all the people to see? Don't you know they're thinking like, I'm not sure this is how it's supposed to go. They're scared. Here they are preaching Jesus Christ, him crucified, and they're being killed by wild animals. There had to be some doubt from time to time. Is this the right thing? Remember, John the Baptist would send his associates to talk to Jesus and say, art thou he, or are we looking for another? Sometimes doubt can work into our minds and can cause us to think terrible things. Here, Elijah wants to die because he thinks that he's supposed to have achieved. God says, and God is pleased with what Elijah has done. Matter of fact, God's a little wanting him to get on with it. Job went through the same thing. You won't find a better man than Job. But Job says, curse the day I was born. Curse the day when the sun came up of that day. He said, I wished I wasn't here. Job would say it was better for me not to have been born than go through what I'm going through. See, that's not something for Job to really decide. God is the God, giver of life, and God controls our death as well. Another symptom is seen in his self-pity. Woe is me. Brethren, there's a passage in Scripture. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 says, there's no trial taking you, a temptation, trial, same thing. But such is common to man. All of us go through them. But God is faithful. Notice, who will not suffer you to be tempted or tried above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Brethren, that's Bible. Friends, that's Bible. That's the God of heaven saying, you can do it. I'm not going to let anything come upon you that you can't handle. And you might say, now, wait a minute, Ron. What about those Christians in the Colosseum dying? And what about the Apostle Paul being executed? What about Jesus on the cross? Folks, sometimes it's God's will that we perish. That, the martyrs, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what God intended to happen. And with the blood of those martyrs, Christianity took over the world. Think of the price they paid, but think of the results and the reward for it. They did exactly what God said. Cost them their life. Cost them their life. They would never see their families again. They would never eat again a meal at a table. But what happened? They woke up and they're in glory. And they're around the throne of God right now to no problems. Rest. The rest that we're all searching for, they are in possession. They have possession of it. Now, none of us want to perish, obviously. It's innate in man to want to survive. But we must realize that this whole life is temporal. And when people do pass away, well, they're simply going the same road that all of us are going down shortly. I know all of us want to stay here longer, and that's absolutely, that's why we're doing all the things that we are right now to try to keep our bodies healthy. So there's no temptation taking you but such as common to man. It says Elijah dealt with his depression by going to bed and sleeping. I was looking at some of the symptoms of depression in preparation for this lesson, and it's amazing because sometimes people have the exact opposite. Sometimes people go to bed and won't get out of bed. Sometimes people can't go to bed. They can't sleep. Some people, they can't eat, as we'll see. The next thing that happens to Elijah, he loses his appetite. Other people with depression go the other extreme, and they eat too much. And they eat more than they need, and they start gaining weight, and they eat more because they're not happy with their bodies and so forth. And so you have people react to depression in different ways, and so we need to be careful with it. But what's God's solution to depression? Confront the problem head on. Notice what God says in 1 Kings 19 at verse 9. Comes to the cave, and he said unto him, this is God speaking to Elijah, what doest thou here, Elijah? Well, God isn't seeking information. He knows exactly what Elijah's doing. He knows the thoughts and intents of man's heart. But what is he saying? What, question, Elijah, person, are you doing here? You've got a job to do. You've got places to go. You need to confront this. Get out in front of it. And then to connect with God. God manifests himself 3 times to Elijah in different things. And the last thing he speaks to him is in a still, small voice. We don't have the time to get into that different. I wish we did. But he tells him, Elijah, get up. You got things to be doing. I've got a king I need you to go anoint over here in Syria. I've got another king I need you to anoint in Israel. And you need to go get this fellow Elisha, who's going to be your replacement as you're getting older. And I want you to, he says, go with it. Go with it. Go to these people. Get out there, socialize, be doing the things you're supposed to be doing. Folks, we can socialize and we can fellowship without leaving our house. Man, we've got FaceTime. We've got Facebook. We've got whatever that is you do on the computer where you look at, I can't even think of the name of it now. But we can see people. Now, trust me, you don't want to see me. I'm not good looking. So we can just talk on the phone. You can do that. We still have phones. You can text. You can email. We can still stay connected like no one has ever been able to do before. Can you imagine the people back in 1918 when they were cut off? They didn't have these luxuries that we do. We're so blessed. We need to think about that. And then bottom line is, you're not alone. You see, this whole time, Elijah, poor me, it didn't work out. I'm not the person I thought I was. I didn't. God says, yet have I left me 7,000 in Israel. 7,000 people in this northern kingdom, God says, who have not kissed the knee or have not bent down, they have not bowed unto Baal, but every mouth which hath not, they haven't kissed Baal. They're not worshiping Baal. They're my people. And there's 7,000 of them. So you get up and you get moving. You got things to do. Notice it says Elijah was a man subject to like passions as we. And he prayed earnestly. And what is these passions? These passions, strengths, weaknesses, success, failures, mountaintops, valleys. We all go through them. Right now, we're going through a tough time. No doubt about it. But we're going to come out on the other side. This too will pass. And we're going to be okay. We just need to remember that and encourage each other in every way that we possibly can to try to help lighten the load as we go through this terrible, terrible time right now that we're going through. So it may be the case that you need to pray to God, that you need the prayers of the church. Maybe you'd even like to become a Christian. We have so many different ways to help you do that, and we would like to help you in any way that we can. You simply can call us, request us by email. My phone, 423-280-2746. You can call me anytime. My time is your time. Think about that. If you need prayers, go to God now and pray as together we sing this song.